Okay, welcome back. I had mentioned this other hat that I wanted to show you real quick, but this is a typical, see it better there as I model it for you. This was the crew hat. The enlisted guys would wear this, and so it's made of like a blue wool felt material, and sometimes they would put the insignia to their particular flotilla. In this case, this is U-96 is the name of would be the boat. Laughing Sawfish, and you can see that in the inside of the hat. And again, not being in person and not being able for you to kind of handle this and look inside really doesn't do it justice, but it is what it is, as they say. And speaking of U-boats and the Battle of the Atlantic, I've got some recommendations for you. One of the best books that's been put out on the Kriegsmarine. It's just filled with photographs, color photographs, and things like that. That's one of my go-tos. This is a translation of the 1942 U-Boat Commander's Handbook. And so if you ever wanted to learn how to sink an enemy ship, this would be the book to go to. This is for those that are, engineering and techie kind of geeks and so forth that like to know the blueprints and everything about a U-boat. This is the book by Eberhard Rosler, The U-Boat. Great book. And then this particular book is U-Boat Combat Missions, and so it's filled with some great photographs. And if you recall, I was telling you the U-boat skipper is the only one that wears the white hat, and here's a picture of a U-boat crew on the conning tower, and you can kind of see that. And so anyway, I'll usually bring a lot of books into class, put them on a table, and let you guys kind of look at them and peruse those. So we're gonna switch gears now and can keep going and cover the rest of this module. So we'll be on slide 27 if you're following along there in the slides. So the Germans countered the aircraft threat by constructing bigger and better and faster U-boats, which were able to reach further out into the Atlantic Ocean, thus evading the range of British aircraft. There was this term called the mid-ocean gap that was coined during the war, and this mid-ocean gap was the area where the Germans knew that they were safe, they were out of range from British bombers and fighter aircraft. And so, but they couldn't get to that mid-Atlantic gap or further with the U-boats that they entered the war with, the Type 7s, if you will. And so, in the book by Eberhard Rosler, it goes into the nomenclature and the technical specifications for every single type of U-boat that was made during the war. If you're just bored one day and you want some light reading, that would be the book. And so, when the war began, the Type 7 U-boat was the standard German submarine. But by late 1941 and early 42, they began developing the larger Type 9 U-boat, which was able to sail completely across the Atlantic to the United States. And so the British countered this by figuring ways to refuel their escort vessels at sea to try to negate that mid-ocean gap advantage that existed. Although the convoy and escort system worked fairly well, German U-boat aces stopped acting independently, like Gunther Prien, for example, and began attacking convoys in what was called wolf packs. And the way this worked was the first U-boat to locate an enemy convoy would not rush in and attack it because that would be suicide. He would radio back to headquarters or communicate back to headquarters using that Enigma device I mentioned, which would then signal other U-boats operating in that same area, perhaps, maybe the same patrol zone, to sort of gather on that one U-boat that had found it. And then, just like in the animal kingdom, a bunch of hungry wolves, they would then attack the convoy. And the wolf pack would be like, a pack of hungry submarines nipping and biting at the heels of the weaker, slower moving vessels in the convoy. If you're an Allied sailor in a convoy, you can imagine how terrifying this would be to know that there's a pack of hungry submarine U-boats looking for you, trying to kill you. The British countered this. Remember, I said at the outset of this lecture that the U-boat war was who could one-up who could counter who, and that's what we're seeing unfold here. And so the British countered the wolf packs by introducing hunter-killer groups, which were escort ships that were unattached to a convoy. And so once a hunter-killer group found a wolf pack, it would harass them just as they were doing the convoys. Next slide. I mentioned this guy in the last lecture rather. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz. Karl Dönitz. He was appointed overall commander of the German Kriegsmarine once Hitler fired Admiral Raeder. Dönitz was a highly decorated U-boat commander in the Great War. He was a confirmed Nazi who believed his submarines offered the best advantage to defeat the British. And the thing is he was right. But he was also a micromanager, and his obsessive control of each and every single U-boat, coupled with his over-reliance on the indecipherable, I'm not even sure the right word to use here, but his over-reliance on the German Enigma machine, that contributed to Britain's ability to eventually break the Enigma code. And in late 1941, Dönitz developed this bold scheme to attack the east coast of the United States. Some people don't even know that the United States was attacked. I mean, everybody knows pretty much Pearl Harbor, but what you may not know is that the eastern seaboard of the United States was under attack in 1941 also. Hitler loved the plan, this bold scheme to attack the eastern coast of the United States. He loved this plan, and he gave Dönitz the green light to start it in January of 1942. And so the operation was named Operation Drumbeat, or in German Pockenschlag, which means literally the beating of kettle drums. And so on December the 18th, 1941, the first wave of 5 Type 9, the new ones, U-boats, left their U-boat bases in France for the east coast of the United States. Now bear in mind, America had only been at war with the Axis powers for really 2 weeks. On January the 13th, 1942, as they approached the eastern seaboard, these U-boats, these 5 U-boats, they remained submerged during the day, and then at night they would surface to basically pick off American ships. And the U-boats were so successful that this became known as the second happy time to the Kriegsmarine. And in the first 2 weeks of 1942, 25 American ships were sunk, 200,000 tons. The next month, in February, 432,000 tons were sunk. And in order to keep the long-range Type 9 boats refueled, the Germans deployed these gasoline or diesel fuel submarines, if you will, which were large replenishment. They called them milk cows that carried extra food, extra torpedoes, extra fuel, and so forth. And one of the primary reasons for the success for the Germans during this American hunting season was the fact that towns like Long Island, New York, Coney Island, and other coastal towns, they refused to turn their lights off at night. There was this blackout order that was issued. And they didn't want to do that because there were tourists that were visiting Long Island, Coney Island, and they were afraid that it would hurt their tourist trade, so they didn't comply. Next slide. Now, if you blow this slide up so you can see it in presentation mode and take a look at it, this is sort of an animated cartoon version of what it would have looked like if you were on board a German submarine, looking through your binoculars at Coney Island, New York. And you can see, if you look at this slide long enough, you'll see a silhouette of a ship passing that's lit up by the lights of Coney Island. And so it made it very easy for German U-boat commanders to pick off these submarines. It was like shooting fish in a barrel, literally. Now, things got so bad that there was a sort of reverse lend-lease with British and Canadian ships being donated to the U.S. Navy to help fight this. And there was no doubt the United States was woefully unprepared to handle the U-boat threat for many of the same reasons that had confounded the Royal Navy in 1939. And these would have been, number one, the United States at the time had too few escort vessels. Number two, they had little practical experience dealing with U-boat attacks. And number three, Admiral King, who was the chief of naval operations, was frankly too stubborn to listen to British advice. King was what we call an Anglophobe. He didn't like the British. He despised them and didn't want to listen to their advice. So once again, we see pride going before destruction. The irony of Operation Drumbeat was the fact that had Admiral Dönitz been given approval to make more U-boats into the operation, then there's every reason to believe they could have won the Battle of the Atlantic. However, British success in North Africa against Rommel and the need to interdict Allied convoys sailing to Russia caused the German High Command to divert a significant number of U-boats to those two theaters. Still, the first half of 1942 proved to be catastrophic for Allied shipping. And during this 6-month span, the Allies lost 3 million tons of shipping in American waters. Next slide. At the beginning of 1942, 3 crucial events influenced the outcome of the Battle of the Atlantic. Number 1, Hitler declared war on America December 11th, 1941. Number 2, U-Boat Command launched an attack against the eastern coast of the United States. I just talked about it, Operation Drumbeat. Number 3, the British introduced a 4th rotor on their Enigma machine, which stumped British code breakers at Bletchley Park for most of 1942. By mid-1942, American industrialization in the form of mass production began turning the tide as the United States was able to produce more ships than the Germans could sink. Additionally, Allied leaders concluded in January of 1943 at the Casablanca Conference that the U-boat threat had to be given top priority. So as a result of Casablanca Conference, strategic bombing was diverted to start bombing U-boat bases and shipyards that were making U-boats throughout Germany and occupied France. More innovation developed, like better German acoustic torpedoes, what was called the Hedgehog anti-submarine device, better radar, and the Germans even invented something called the snorkel, which was this tube that enabled a submarine to recharge its electric batteries without having to surface, thereby making itself a target. So the snorkel was just that. It was a tube, went up. It allowed the electric batteries to recharge with air and so forth without exposing themselves to danger. But by far, the greatest technological advancement to develop during the Battle of the Atlantic was the breaking of the German Enigma device. You can Google search the Enigma and see what it looked like, but a very remarkable machine. And a man by the name of Alan Turing, a British mathematician actually, is the one who is credited with breaking the Enigma code. Now, for all its drama, the Battle of the Atlantic was not solely about the war being waged underwater. There were some major surface battles that happened, and some major surface vessels that the Kriegsmarine had developed, probably some of the best in the world they had at the time. And so because of this, because the Battle of the Atlantic was so important and intense, that the Germans had to divert some of their surface fleet resources. Now think about it. The British Empire had territories in New Zealand, Australia, India, South Africa, and so that meant that the German Navy had to dispatch ships to, fight in those areas as well. Next slide. At the outset of the war, December 1939, the Battle of the River Plate became the first naval battle of the Second World War. Now, I talked about the U-boat that sunk the SS Athenia, but that was not a naval battle. That was a cruise liner getting sunk by a U-boat. So the first naval battle of the war was the Battle of the River Plate. And interestingly, it took place in South America, of all places. And this is how it went. The German cruiser Admiral Graf Spee had been located in the South Atlantic a long time before the war began, and had been commerce raiding after the war began. ended up sinking some 50,000 tons of shipping. And when the Graf Spee attempted to try her luck hunting merchant shipping off the coast of South America, she was run aground by 3 British ships. And this 3 British ship hunting squadron sent by the British Admiralties to search for Graf Spee was made up of 3 Royal Navy cruisers, the HMS Exeter, the HMS Ajax, and the HMS Achilles. And they found and engaged the Graf Spee off the estuary of the River Plate close to the coast of Argentina and in Uruguay. In the ensuing battle, the Exeter was severely damaged and had to retire. The Ajax and the Achilles suffered moderate damage. But the damage to the Graf Spee, although not extensive, was critical because it ruptured her fuel system. So the Ajax and the Achilles shadowed the German ship, the Graf Spee, until she entered the port of Montevideo, the capital city of Uruguay, which, by the way, was neutral during the war. After Graf Spee's captain, a man by the name of Hans Langeldorf, was told that he couldn't stay any more than 72 hours in Montevideo because it was a neutral country, he decided to scuttle his ship, in other words, destroy it, rather than face the overwhelming superior force that the British had led him to believe was awaiting him. When Langsdorff saw the tiny British force that awaited his ship was not this massive force that he thought, he was ashamed and he shot himself to refute any charge of cowardice. Committed suicide. Next slide. In May of 1941, the Germans unveiled the mightiest battleship in the world. This way surpassed the HMS Dreadnought, and its name was the Bismarck, and named after the Prussian Prime Minister Otto von Bismarck. And there's a video in supplementary video I've included that you can watch on the sinking of the Bismarck. Sailing from Goathaven off the northern coast of Poland, along with the cruiser Prinz Eugen, the ensuing chase by the British to sink the Bismarck became the high point of the naval war in the Atlantic. Movies have been made about this chase. Books have been written about it. But basically, it culminated in a 20-minute engagement when they finally found her, called the Battle of the Denmark Strait. And when the Bismarck encountered the British HMS Hood and the Prince of Wales on May the 24th, 1941, the Bismarck instantly, they drew first blood. They fired a salvo of shells that hit the HMS Hood's ammunition supply just behind her main mast, and that resulted in this massive explosion. It split the ship in two. Explosion rose 1,000 feet in the air. She sank in 90 seconds, taking 1,400 British sailors with her. However, this was a Pyrrhic victory for the Bismarck, because she had to kind of limp back to a safe dry dock repair facility in occupied France. And after a couple more hits on the Bismarck, the Prince of Wales sailed away, and the resulting pursuit by the Royal Navy to avenge the Hood became something like, Captain Ahab's pursuit of Moby Dick. After forming a ring around the Bismarck's position 690 miles from Brest, France, the British battleships HMS Rodney and the HMS King George V, along with the carrier, the Ark Royal, attacked and damaged her rudder. And so as these ships closed in for the attack, the Bismarck, the rudder was broken, so all she could do was sail in circles. And as these British ships closed in for the attack, fired their shells, the Bismarck went down within 2 hours on May the 27th, 1941. Only 110 sailors from that ship survived. Now, the sinking of the Bismarck basically finished the German surface campaign, with the exception of some minor skirmishing off the coast of German-occupied Norway. But by late 1944, the entire German surface fleet was basically gone. Next slide. When the last U-boat, U-234, surrendered in May of 1945, the statistics for the Battle of the Atlantic were incredible. 2,600 ships were sunk, 60,000 Allied sailors died, 785 U-boats were sunk, 156 surrendered. But here's the biggest thing of all. This is astounding to me. Of the 40,000 U-boat sailors that went to war during the war, 40,000 German sailors, 30,000 died. That's a 90% loss rate, folks. An interesting thought to consider is that the Germans might have improved their chances of winning World War II if they had maybe never prosecuted the Battle of the Atlantic. But because the Third Reich lacked the resources to fight a war on so many fronts, in other words, Hitler bit off more than he could chew, focusing all their resources into the air and ground campaign would have made sense. Another fact to consider is the indirect effect the U-boat war had on American shipbuilding. Without the terrible losses inflicted by the U-boats in the summer and fall of 1940, the United States might never have embarked on its massive program of assembly line mass production to supply Britain with ships. In the end, it was pride that sealed Germany's fate in the Battle of the Atlantic. In spite of evidence that the British had broken the German Enigma code, the Germans simply refused to believe the evidence because of their overconfidence in the superiority of their technology. All right, so we're going to stop there with the Battle of the Atlantic and the remaining few slides that I have, and I'll probably try to plow through this now versus making another video, will be on the air war. So slide 35 is what I've got. Years may be a slide off in Canvas, but we'll begin this module, or this section of Module 5 on the air war. Noted early 20th century air power theorist, a guy by the name of Giulio Douhet. Giulio Douhet wrote in his famous book, Command of the Air, these famous words, quote, "To have command of the air means to be in a position to wield offensive power so great it defies human imagination. It means to be able to cut an enemy's army and navy off from their bases of operation and nullify their chances of winning the war," end quote. Douhet has since become known as the father of modern air power. Next slide. British officer Hugh Trenchard fought much of the Great War as the head of the Royal Flying Corps in France, and like Douhet, he was a firm believer in offensive operations for air forces, and he believed in the massed offensive as the key to victory. Trenchard was crucial in forming the Royal Air Force. Next slide. In the United States, General William or Billy Mitchell is often referred to as the father of the modern Air Force. And the major premise of his theories was his belief that an independent and equal Air Force serving under a unified Department of Defense was the most efficient means of defending the United States. Mitchell became the leading advocate for a strong, independent Air Force, a robust national aeronautics capability made up of military and commercial assets. And because of his zealous campaign for air power and his open criticism of those charged with air power's development, he actually precipitated his own court-martial in 1925. 11 years after his death, the United States Air Force became its own branch of service. So Douhet, Trenchard, and Mitchell are three of the most famous advocates for the concept of what we're going to talk about next, strategic air power or strategic bombing. Strategic bombing has been used by the United States since World War II, but limited 20th century wars like Korea, Vietnam proved that strategic bombing is really only effective in total war. And even then, the debate rages as to how effective was it in World War II. Next slide. So let's briefly talk about strategic bombing during Korea and Vietnam. So logic demanded that if strategic bombing were to be the decisive air power strategy in the Korean War, then that Washington should have directed attacks on Peking, China, and Moscow, Russia, because it was the Chinese and the Russians who were making and supplying the North Koreans with war material. Obviously, the Cold War prevented such a strategy, and within 2 months from the start of the Korean War, American bombers had run out of industrial targets. Next slide. During the Vietnam War, Operation Rolling Thunder became the first of many sustained bombing campaigns of that war, was intended to destroy the North Vietnamese transportation system, industrial bases, air defenses, and to halt the flow of men and material into South Vietnam along something known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. But attainment of these objectives was made difficult because of the restrictions, rules of engagement imposed upon the United States, and because of the Cold War. The Cold War was still going on. And so strategic bombing really only works in total war, not limited wars like Korea and Vietnam. Next slide. One of the major controversies to arise after the Second World War was the question of whether or not strategic bombing was truly effective in ending the war. So before we can argue this, we have to know what really defines strategic bombing. Strategic bombing is a military strategy used in both total and limited wars with the goal of defeating the enemy by destroying their morale and or their economic ability to produce and transport war material to the troops that need it. It can utilize strategic bombers, long and medium-range missiles, or even nuclear-armed aircraft to attack targets deemed vital to the enemy's war-making ability, or something that military theorist Karl von Clausewitz would have termed the enemy's center of gravity. One of the major goals of strategic bombing is also to demoralize the enemy, to demoralize the civilian population so that peace or surrender becomes preferable to continuing the war. Strategic bombing was first used during the Great War, and though it was really not understood in its present form, like it then, the first bombing of a city was on the night of August the 24th, 1914, just 11 years after the Wright brothers made their airplane debut at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. This bombing, however, was not from an airplane. This bombing involved the dropping of 8 bombs from a German airship called a Zeppelin. We would call it a blimp, on the Belgian city of Antwerp. Next slide. Zeppelins, or airships, were hydrogen-filled vessels invented by Ferdinand von Zeppelin, as he was inspired by seeing American Civil War balloons. In 1909, Zeppelin founded the world's first airline, the German Airship Travel Corporation. Next slide. Initially, Zeppelins were intended to be pleasure cruises for the wealthy, and they could carry about 20 people. Next slide. It was like traveling aboard a luxury cruise liner. Traveling on Zeppelins back then was a status symbol, kind of like flying first class, if you will, on an airplane today. Next slide. During World War I, Zeppelins were really first used as reconnaissance aircraft because they were silent. They could sail through the air and nobody could hear them. But later on, the German military used them for bombing missions, especially targeting London. And although Zeppelin bombings were not very effective, the terror that they spread throughout the British population was significant. There was something about these massive silent killers that was truly dreadful to the citizens below. Next slide. The role of the Zeppelin as a strategic bomber, however, was short-lived, as the British military discovered that a couple of well-placed shots by newly developed incendiary bullets was enough to ignite that flammable hydrogen inside that airship and send it and its crew to a fiery death. Next slide. So let's shift back to World War II and discuss the applications and limitations of strategic bombing. Well, number one, Germany was the first nation to try and conquer another nation solely by using air power during the Battle of Britain. In retaliation, Britain began her own strategic bombing campaign on Berlin. However, both sides of the conflict, both Axis and Allies, soon realized there were some limitations to strategic bombing. Bombers had limited payloads and limited range, and daylight bombing proved to be too dangerous because of enemy fighters. And so throughout 1940 and 1941, both sides were countering one another's technological innovations, kind of the way they did in the Battle of the Atlantic. Next slide. In 1942, the Royal Air Force had a new air marshal, a man by the name of Arthur Bomber Harris, and Harris orchestrated a 1,000-plane nighttime raid on the fourth largest city in Germany, a city named Cologne, in May of 42. This was called area bombing, and this massive raid saw the Royal Air Force deploy over 1,100 aircraft. They only lost 44. Next slide. When the dust cleared from Cologne, the British were able to take some photos of the damage that they realized it was not the success that they hoped it would be. The city of Cologne was not destroyed, and the Royal Air Force realized that to destroy even one city, they would have to raid again and again and again with thousands of planes. Because Arthur Harris was a disciple of Douay, he believed that area bombing would destroy German morale. However, Just like the British during the London Blitz, German morale only hardened and solidified. Next slide. Also in 1942, the United States Army Air Force began strategic bombing, with the 8th Air Force taking the lead, commanded by General Ira Eaker. Next slide. The Americans decided to undertake a different approach to strategic bombing than that of the British. And rather than conducting area bombing missions during the nighttime, the Americans conducted targeted bombing raids during the daytime. Next slide. By using a new innovation called the Norden bomb sight, American B-17 bomber crews boasted that they could drop a bomb in a pickle barrel. Next slide. After the Casablanca Conference ended in January 43, both the Royal Air Force and the 8th Air Force carried out what's called Operation Point Blank, which was the code name for an attempt to destroy the Luftwaffe and its infrastructure prior to the D-Day landings in June of 1944. So again, why would that be important? Well, to have command of the air means to be in a position to wield offensive power so great that, according to Douay, it defies human imagination. And so this was to be accomplished through this combined bomber offensive against German aircraft factories, ball bearing plants, fuel depots, and other related targets. So the first major test of Operation Point Blank was the selection of the German city of Schweinfurt and one of its first main targets, known as the ball bearing district. And so if the U.S. Army Air Force could destroy the German ball bearing production through targeted bombing, they figured they could severely hamper the German war effort. They also chose the city of Regensburg, and that was because that was where Messerschmitt fighter aircraft were being built. And so this was Strategic Bombing 101, and this is what Billy Mitchell had been advocating since the Great War. Next slide. Now, what the Allies didn't anticipate was Germany's introduction of the world's first operational jet fighter aircraft, the Me-262. On 17 August 1943, the 8th Air Force destroyed some 376 aircraft to attack Schweinfurt's ball bearing factory, as well as aircraft factories in Regensburg. But the new German Me-262 shot down 60 American bombers. After a couple weeks of these types of missions, the United States losses proved so catastrophic that they had to resort to unescorted nighttime bombing like the British had been doing all along. By 1944, the American P-51B Mustang fighter had the capability to escort American bombers deeper into the heart of Germany. And so, in mid-February 1944, Operation Argument, also known as Big Week, commenced. Big Week required American forces to fly enormous numbers of missions against manufacturing plants all over Germany. And because of the new P-51 Mustang fighter escort aircraft, they could do that with more protection. They wouldn't have to rely upon doing it at night. And in less than a week, the 8th Air Force embarked on 3,000 missions from bases in England, while the 15th Air Force flew around 500 missions from Italy, dropping around 10,000 bombs. And so Big Week proved successful because it devastated the Luftwaffe's single-engine fighter aircraft production. During the entire war, the Allies dropped 2.7 million tons of bombs on Germany, and 3 great bombing raids stand out as decisive. Next slide. The first was the bombing of the city of Hamburg, codenamed Operation Gomorrah. The Allies used a type of bomb called an incendiary bomb because it was able to start massive fires. And on June the 24th and 5th of 1943, British and American bombers dropped incendiary bombs on Hamburg, setting the entire city on fire. Thousands of fires erupted all over the city. The temperature within the city reached 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and the superheated air rushed through the city at speeds in excess of 300 miles an hour. Thousands of people simply disappeared in this intense heat. They were vaporized. Over 40,000 German civilians died. And in spite of Joseph Goebbels' propaganda efforts to kind of keep the disaster out of the news, a wave of fear and dread spread over Germany. And so in this respect, Douay, his theory was spot on. Next slide. In February 45, 1,250 Allied bombers dropped more than 3,900 tons of high explosive bombs and incendiaries on the city of Dresden. The bombing and resulting firestorm destroyed over 1,600 acres of the city, killed 25,000 people. Next slide. In the Pacific, American B-29 bombers under the command of Curtis LeMay began firebombing the city of Tokyo in November of 1944. Of course, this finally culminates in the dropping of 2 atomic bombs in August of 1945. Amazingly, you would think that such widespread devastation to both Germany and Japan would have caused them to surrender. However, post-war studies on the efficacy of strategic bombing have shown that just like Pharaoh's heart in the book of Exodus, after the 10 plagues, Axis leadership hardened. Next slide. In retaliation for the bombings of Cologne and Hamburg and Dresden and Tokyo, Hitler began using a new type of cruise missile called the V-1 or the Buzz Bomb, V standing for vengeance, to terrorize British citizens. And Japan began to arm every one of their citizens for the coming American-led invasion that they were sure was to come. Next slide. There was a huge propaganda backlash as a result of these Allied terror bombings. Churchill tried to distance himself from it, and Germany threatened to disjoint themselves from the Geneva Convention over this. Many felt that both Roosevelt and Churchill should have been tried as war criminals. Now, certainly, had Germany and Japan won the war, that no doubt would have happened. But there's no evidence that the Royal Air Force's area bombing had any significant military or political impact. The United States Army Air Force's attacks were comparatively more effective, but their limitations were severe, and overall success was modest at best. While strategic bombing did diminish the overall strength of the Luftwaffe, making it easier for American aircraft to bomb the Normandy beaches on D-Day, in the final analysis, it was certainly not the war-winning strategy that had been hoped. We're going to, real quick, go over the note sheet and for lesson 5, and then I'll close this video out. Let me just bring this up here real quick. Okay, so if you want to grab your lesson 5 note sheet, I'm just going to give you the answers for sake of time. So number 1, the first major propaganda victory. It was the sinking of the HMS Royal Oak by Gunther Preen's U-47 at Scapa Flow. And if I'm going too fast, you can simply review this part of the video. Number 2, the answer is Alfred Thayer Mahan. 3, Commerce Rating. 4, HMS Dreadnought. 5, SS Athenia. 6, France. 7, Convoy. 8, Corvettes. 9, First Happy Time. 10, Q-Ships. 11, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz. 12, Operation Drumbeat. 13, Admiral Ernest J. King. 14, Casablanca. 15, Alan Turing. 16, it's the Battle of the River Plate. 17, Denmark Strait and HMS Hood. 18, 90%. 19, Bletchley Park. 20, Bismarck. 21, Morale and Economic. 22, Zeppelin and Antwerp. 23, Range and Payload. 24, Arthur Bomber Harris. 25, Giulio Douay. 26, General Ira Eaker and 8th. 27, Norden Bombsight. 28, Schweinfurt. 29, Gamora. 30, V1. 31, it's Targeted and Daylight. 32 is Dresden. 33, Germany. 34, Tinfoil. 35, Daylight. 36, Casablanca. 37, Schweinfurt. Again. 38, P-51 Mustang. 39, G, spelled G-E-E. And 40, Douay and Military. 41, letter H. 42, letter A. 43, letter G. 44, J. 45, C. 46, L. 47, M. 48, K. 49, F. 50, I. 51, B. 52, D. And 53, E.